Hey people, so we've got the Lenovo ThinkPad P17 here. It's a review video. It's a little bit longer than usual, but we'll try to see if this format works. There's going to be chapters. Before we start, please do subscribe and like the channel if you enjoy the content. It's really valuable for us to get that sort of feedback. Towards the end of 2020, Lenovo has announced this along with the P15 and other laptops. So on paper, cooling is an area of focus on this model. I think the P73, the predecessor of this model, it could have improved there. So I think that's one of the areas where it's hoping to address. We'll look at that. So everything else on this machine, it's it starts quite reasonably accessible price for workstation. So spec-wise, this laptop can go from more affordability-focused i5 plus the T1000 Quadro up to the flagship RTX 5000 plus Xeon, and RAM-wise goes up to 128. So it's very much a flagship laptop in that sense. One of the constraints, it seems to be that there's only two M2 slots. I guess you might be saying, oh, that's plenty, but I guess for workstation of this level, I think some people prefer a little bit more, but I think that's the thing I can think of. The keyboard is different to the P73, so we've done a section later on. Take a look. So the P series traditionally is used by professionals who need the dependability and also that performance level. They don't mind if the laptop is a little bit heavier, as the case here. This is a 3.5 kilos. Look at them pushing the car. This must be how it feels like to carry the laptop. I'm just kidding. Okay, looking on the inside, the privacy shutter can be a little bit hard to open unless you press the right part where there's a ridge bit. But I think looking at some of the HP mechanism and some of the Dell, this one is a little bit harder to open. But it's good that it has a privacy shutter. On the inside, in comparison to, let's say, a Dell, the latest generation Precision, and the HP ZBook G7, the bezel will be seen as quite significant. I guess on the plus side, you do have the ability to take off the bezel and swap on a screen more easily if it's out of warranty. With some of the lighter workstation laptops, it's now a case where the whole display is one part. I mean, that from repairability perspective is not great. Not the most compact bezel, but I guess at least we get to keep the repairability aspect of it. So on the inside, you see the speaker grills. Some of the dust over time might catch in the area. But on the inside, you no longer have the activities indicator for the hard drive and the Wi-Fi, if I remember correctly. And there's also no more P17 logo here. A little bit cleaner a design. Some people might miss the activity LED, but it's this is a progress. On the inside, material is reasonably pleasant. It's rubberized. It doesn't feel really rough. You'll probably have noticed on the bottom, you no longer have the bottom clicks. So that's one of the difference to the machine before. Fingerprint sensor still. You are starting to see some of the manufacturers starting to integrate this into the power button, but I think at the moment, on a bigger workstation, that's perfectly fine. On this particular model, we have the Pantone color calibration. So it's we have the 4K panel along with that. So very much the high-end option. Being able to calibrate your screen is a useful option. Just have a feel of the lid. Yeah, it feels quite solid. It's very little give, and once you move it, it stabilizes quite quickly. I think that's what we can think of. What we'll probably gather here is the battery is very much internal. So you'd have to remove the whole cover, not just the tiny user service door. It's considered sealed battery. Some people prefer swappable battery, of course, but I think this seems to be the direction of travel. I think one of the other difference between this and P73 is on the 9th gen processor, you tend to be able to undervolt. Just here to take a look at the exterior of the P17. So we've got it here. It's probably a little bit hard to imagine the size, so we'll give you a quick comparison. So we've actually got the X1. So this is like Dell's version of the XPS 15. So just massive difference on each side. So I think against the trend of laptops getting thinner and lighter and throttling more, what this has Lenovo to do is give it more beefy cooling systems. So let's say you're paying for i9 or a Xeon processor. It's really nice to be able to get closer to that level of performance without the heat management getting in the way. On the whole, I think the chassis is incredibly robust. The lid is really robust. I think even in the center, it's still very little give. So it's very, very robust machine. Very nice. Let's take a look at the hinge. So I think the hinge, it goes all the way back. This is quite nice. Not entirely sure what you'll be doing sort of looking that way, but it lets you do that. So that's quite nice. Can you open it with one hand? Let's give it a try. Yeah, you can see the laptop twisting slightly, so probably not far off it, but probably not a good idea. So 2 hands. And on the base cover, I'm not sure if you can see, there's actually quite a thick rubber stripe here, and also here and here. I think reading comments online, some people have been having a slight unit-specific glitch where it's not completely flat, but I think that's quite rare. I think this unit, this unit is very flat, thankfully. But if you do have a unit where it's not completely flat when it arrives, contact Lenovo. I think they'll usually be able to walk you through some options. On the whole, it seems to be a very incredibly robust machine. I think the only question is whether these rubber bits are durable or not. Effectively, what it's doing is allowing the laptop to draw more air from underneath the laptop. So ideally, use it on a flat surface if you can. If we do the blender BMW, we'll just give you an idea of how it's like to use. As you can see, this laptop in BMW pulls quite a bit of power. So it's actually higher than the 230 from the charger rating. So with this design specifically, you can see the rubber feet on the base of the unit. So 2 at the front, small feet, and then a bar of feet on the base. I think you can see here. So what that means is you really should use this laptop on a flat surface if you can. And it's not going to put any air from the back, only from the side and the front. So make sure that it's on a flat surface. I think as long as it's getting enough air, it should be able to run quite fast. It's nice that it's able to keep the system quite cool. And obviously I hope the rubber feet over time stays there, because otherwise the laptop wouldn't be completely flat. It's almost like they're 2 different laptop types. It's madness. Okay, as you can see from the screen, dimension-wise, it's a little bit wedged. So front is not as tall, but the rear is much taller than the P73. It's actually, when we compare back to back, it's actually quite noticeable. So that's quite an interesting one. Okay, let's take a look at the ports. So on the right-hand side, smart card and SD card. Really great for the SD card is still here. 2 USB 3 Type A. And the heat vent is, it gets in the way slightly if you're right-handed, but that's life. At the back, Ethernet, USB-C, 2 Thunderbolt, and the charging port. It's a little bit strange to have a charging port right at the center, but I think that's a new design. On the left-hand side of the laptop, you have HDMI 2 and another USB Type A port. The SIMS slot seems to be optional, so if you didn't config with it, then you're stuck, it's sealed. But if you did config the laptop with it, then it's there. And also lastly, the audio jack. So solid set of ports. How does it compare with the older P73? Well, we have the P73 on top now. So as you can see, the vent on the P73 has been moved forward a little bit. So if you're right-handed, you'll notice that more. And also, slightly thankfully though, the audio jack now is on the other side, and it's not really as forward anymore. So in the P73 case, it would have got in the way quite noticeably if you were right-handed. But if you're left-handed, it's less an issue. As you can see, the new model has a smaller vent on this side, which is interesting. And at the back, really, really similar. So as you can see here, the positioning of the power is moved onto the center. So that's what I was speaking about. The vents seems to be a little bit larger, but not too much, if that makes sense. When we have them next to each other, then you'll notice actually there's quite significant difference at the rear of the laptop. The new P17 is taller at the back and very comparable at the front. So that means you have a slightly wedged shape. It's quite interesting. It's definitely not thin and light anymore. Looking on the outside, the most distinguishable thing to notice to spot the P17 is really this logo, which has started appearing on more laptops. It's just basically saying this is a ThinkPad brought to you by Lenovo. I think on the old model you had one service door which you could have just removed, then you got access to some of the stuff. I think now it's a little bit different. Now it's the user serviceable part has shrunk. So it's a 2 M2 and 2 RAM slots here and 2 RAM slots under the cover and 4G card, and on the inside another 2 slots under the keyboard, as well as the Wi-Fi card and the 4G card. So you would have to remove the keyboard to reach that. To see more of the laptop, in addition to this cover, you would have to remove the whole base to see more, for instance, the GPU, the CPU, heatsink, etc. One interesting observation, so this is a new model and this is an old one. If we had to quickly clean the lid, because they will get fingerprints on them, then if you use a microfiber cloth, can't really hear anything on the old one. Interesting. So the case material is a little bit different. So when you clean this one, it feels a little bit more rugged. This one feels more smooth, the old P73. So I would probably say it's easier to drop the P73 than the new one, because the new one is more rugged. Okay, so from just briefly looking at it, I think the P17 is probably going to attract the fingerprint potentially a little bit less than before, but it's probably too early to say. It's useful to have a microfiber cloth anyway, just so you can tidy it up after the fingerprint gets on them.
Hey people, so this is internal footage from the laptop Zoom webcam. So OBS capture highest quality. We've simply made it full screen. As you can see, it's a fixed focus lens. So if you do move from the front and back, don't expect to pin sharp focus. But at the same time, you're never going to be too much out of focus, if that makes sense. I'm just trying to move across the frame to see if there's any frame drops. It seems to be okay, because at the moment we're in a bright office setting. You'll hear some background noise. I'm not sure how much you can pick up from the mic or if it cancels that out. As you can see, the light, so this is a ceiling light. It seems to do an okay job, but it blows the details, if that makes sense. And also the facial features, it's very slightly blurry, even in daytime setting. Right, so the internal webcam, so we've closed the window blinds in the room, so it's much darker. It's not complete blackout because some of the light gets through the edge of the window frame, and just one tiny lamp in the background. You can't really see it here. So as you can expect, this is replicating a lower light setting. So facial feature much softer than before, and if you look at the details, you can't really see much definition anymore. If I move my face, I think across that's a bright side, some light gets through there, but if I get through the edge of the frame, you can see very little sharpness and a lot more blurry facial feature. So in the center of the frame is still better, it seems. Roughly the skin tone seems to be okay. It's very much a 2020, pre-2020 webcam. Obviously, I hope they can make it better in the future, but external webcam option will always be there if needed.
Good friends will part sometimes, that's just the way it goes. Don't waste your life banging on doors that have been closed. Sometimes the ones you trust the most will let you down. Life doesn't hold back when it's kicking you around. You claim to little love, to little taste it, little heartache. You got to just forget the ones who hurt you for your own sake.
The speakers, they work in this laptop it's a little bit less impressive than what we might see on some laptops, for instance HP or the Dell competitors. Bass is a little bit missing on this model. There's some, but there's a desire for more. The mid is quite clear and the high frequency generally seems to be okay. It's not too fatiguing. External speaker or headphone will be something you probably want. And you can see the loudness here. This speaker is going to be helpful if you're running presentations, but it's not going to be too loud. Okay, so we've got the P17 here. So the keyboard, it's the same physical keyboard as the smaller sibling of the P15. That laptop, as we've noticed in Norhansang, there's some flex in the left-hand side, where if you press it, there's almost a little bit rattling noise. Thankfully, in the P17, this is less of an issue because I think it's a bigger chassis, it's a little bit more stability. If you nitpick, then you press something, for instance, at the center, which is better supported, and then you press the letter A, you sort of notice a little bit more unevenness here still. But, you know, it's much better, it seems, than the P15. When I click on this key, for instance, especially the backspace key on the P73, it's just so satisfying. It's almost like a mini typewriter. On the new one, what is this? I mean, these are small details which, you know, you probably wouldn't necessarily pick up. Otherwise, some of the keys are smaller. The top row is softer, I think. The P73 is, in many aspects, class leading in this keyboard. The P17 is probably only average, I would probably say, for workstation. This is because when you press down the keys, the keyboard travel, it feels really light. And when you hit the dampening at the end to signal, oh, no more travel, it just feels really artificial. Whereas the older key, it had a little bit more resistance in the key action. It's just more satisfying. And also when you have a little bit more resistance, it gives you the impression that it's coming back up more quickly. So that key, it just feels more pleasant to type on. And it's also a little bit more predictable to use. So you get used to it a lot more quickly, make less typos. Sometimes a predictable keyboard with predictable response, it just lets you not worry about it. For me personally, the P17 didn't hit that sort of pleasantness or daily use good enough test. But that's only because, you know, at this price, the expectation is sky high, if that makes sense. So we don't want to sound as if we're nitpicking. It's still an okay keyboard. It's just not necessarily one that you would expect in this price, in this level of machine. It's but to be honest, if given the chance, I would really prefer this machine, but with an older keyboard. But I know that's not possible. I mean, it's almost as if you remember back in the days, you used to have to stick something underneath the keyboard just to reduce the flex.
Looking at the thermals, we've got the laptop firstly on the dedicated only graphics setting in BIOS. So it means that the RTX graphics runs all the time. It's more stable in terms of some softwares that we see. So what we have here is YouTube 1080p playing and 5 news tabs refreshing at 30 seconds interval. So 5 tabs continuously refreshing. Not totally light, but I wouldn't say this is heavy workload. As you can probably see on the top cover, there is a particular area that's hotter, so it's the top left corner. The other hotter part seems to be on the upper part of the casing, so you don't really touch it as much. The palm rests, the keyboard, they're nice and quite cool. On the base cover, you can see from this photo, some parts of this gets as high as 50 degrees just playing YouTube. It's a little bit on the higher side. This is why if you want to run the dedicated graphics mode, it's useful to not use your laptop on your lab, so use it on the desk. The hybrid mode would make this laptop cooler to run, but I guess the trade-off there is some of the softwares might not like it as much. But I think generally it's quite a stable one to use.
The top left corner is a little bit hot, but I think most of the user accessible part is kept within a reasonable temperature. On the base cover, you can see some hot spots when it's under heavier workload, but I think that is quite manageable if you have it on a desk. Wouldn't recommend having this laptop on your legs though, as that would possibly heat up quite a bit. Here we've got the CPU plus GPU workload. It gets a little bit more toasty, same positions, and as you can see the heat intensifies a little bit more. And I think FurMark here is being throttled back a little bit because I think GPU generally can detect the FurMark benchmarking, so they usually clock down. So this is probably not the worst case scenario. One of the options in BIOS, it's actually quite an interesting option. It's something that you typically expect on workstation. So you can either enable the hybrid graphics or you can run discrete only graphics. The system consumes more power and gives a little bit more heat in the dedicated graphics mode, but that's only because it's that's the only graphics card it has in that mode. So when you have hybrid graphics, in theory should switch on the dedicated graphics when it's needed, but other times default back to Intel integrated graphics. I think personally, running the 3D apps, it's a little bit more stable with the discrete graphics only. It does stun the battery a little bit. So during our testing, the battery life ranged anything between 4 to 5 minutes to maybe just over 3 hours. So battery-wise, it has a battery. It's probably more aptly considered to be an uninterrupted power supply rather than a laptop that you really want to run on battery. The charging speed is quite fast with the 230 watts charger. The marketing spec promises 80% charge within about 1 hour. So that's something. But otherwise, you can still switch back to the old BIOS layout just in case. And there's a usual Intel control just in case you want to add security feature to this laptop. But yeah, it's quite a standard BIOS. Right, so we're 1 hour into this, running the hybrid mode on the laptop. So it's the same test. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So the tabs, they auto refresh every 30 seconds, along with the fireplace video playing in Full HD. So what we've seen is after 1 hour, it's estimating that it has about 80% battery life. So that means effectively you probably get 5 to 6 hours when you're doing the really light stuff that doesn't require the dedicated graphics. But as soon as you start using the graphic card, the battery, it drains really quickly. And it's worth mentioning that the battery life when you have the laptop set in hybrid mode in BIOS is quite a different pattern to when you have it set on dedicated only, because when you have it running dedicated only, the graphics can use anything between 8 to 40 watts really easily. So when you have that switched on, your battery life will be a lot shorter. When we switch to the dedicated GPU only mode, you will see the battery shrinks a lot more. So to get to the same percentage from 100, you'll see that instead of consuming 1 hour, it only took about 35 minutes. So in reality, on the dedicated graphics mode, your battery life is likely to be probably 2 to 3 hours on the very light workload, where things are just refreshing, if that makes sense. Because every panel is different, although we've got the 4K, some panel might have a little bit more IPS glow around the edge. We're doing quite well on this panel ourselves. It's really, really stunning color, and if you just look at red, generally speaking, it's really nice. It would have been nice to have a Full HD 500 nits option though, but at the moment you only have the Full HD 300 nits and 4K 500 nits. Having a dedicated graphics can definitely help to speed up the export. I think we've got 3.5 minutes to export to 10 minutes footage in 4K in Premiere. It's a reasonable speed. Just to say, this is not a gaming laptop. It has NVIDIA Quadro graphics, which is optimized for the CAD workload. What you need for gaming really is NVIDIA GeForce graphics. I mean, having said that, here's the temperature while playing Final Fantasy 15 at the highest setting. The fan gets quite loud immediately. It gets quite hot. The game struggles a little bit on anything above 30 frames on the high setting. 4K looks great though. At 1440p 60 frames per second, it drops a few frames to around 56 frames per second, but didn't really notice much difference. Still looks great, and the fan didn't get overly loud. So let's actually take a look inside Feeling Adventures. Disable the battery in BIOS first. Obviously we've already disassembled slightly. So there's going to be some captive screws. First thing that comes off is the base cover. So it shows you the M2, two of it. So that's and 2 additional RAM slots. What you'll notice is some captive screws here, and one there. Don't forget those 2, otherwise, ouch. So look at the Lenovo's hardware service menu first before you do this at your own risk. What we've done is follow the menu and went all the way around the edge in terms of the prying. So I think we've already done this. So it's actually surprisingly easy. I think it's front, then it's back. Okay, so we'll just show you. On the inside, what you have is firstly 94 watts hour battery, smaller than the battery in the P73, but really marginal difference. You can see it being connected onto the motherboard. So it's almost like a tiny preview window that this cover hides away. So what you'll otherwise see is a BIOS battery, just in case you need to maintain it, quite easy access. And USB on this side seems to be a daughter board, which is quite nice because, you know, with the USB it's much better if you can replace a USB rather than having to replace a whole motherboard, which has a big cost, especially out of warranty one day. On the other side, it's the 3.5 jack, the HDMI, and the other USB. They're on the main board, as are the other 2 fans. So on the right hand side, you have the GPU. So this, on the whole, you can see this is actually a removable module. So this is graphic card. It's, I think, proprietary to Lenovo. So effectively, the graphic card is cooled by, you can see 2 heat pipes going to this bigger fan on this side. It's actually really a beefy fan. I'd have expected a little bit more CPU cooling, but I think on this model, their calculation is probably based on the graphic card being the one that generates some heat, and also some of the heat from the CPU is probably redirected to the bigger heatsink. Definitely not symmetrical in terms of the cooling capacity by the side. So effectively, the 2 RAM slots, 1 and 2 underneath. So there's the cover. That's quite nice. There's 2 more under the keyboard. I think from a repair's perspective, this is just absolutely delightful, because if you had to replace a fan, service a heatsink, you're not more than this number of screws away to access the system, especially a thermal paste. To do more disassembling, which we're not going to do here, then you'd have to disconnect the fans. We're assuming that you disable the battery in BIOS first. Then I think after removing these screws, then the fans may come out, exposing the CPU and the GPU. So I think that's the common one where people use to repaste. Otherwise, it's quite a standard design. It's rotated. So just in case I miss anything. So battery connects into the motherboard. As you can see, the connector for the daughter board. Actually, surprisingly, the daughter board actually connects into the fan to power the fan. But yeah, so effectively the graphic module sits on top of the motherboard. So I assume once the fan is released, the graphic module, you can move it up and remove it. On this model, I think because the graphics in a way is modular, what Lenovo has the luxury of is being able to do wider range of specification with the same hardware. So I think with the previous P53, P73, because the graphics were built into the motherboard, that meant a little bit harder to manage the SKUs. So you can see the Ethernet, everything else on the edge of the board. On the actual fans, you see the fans are really massive. In reality, it's big, but it's not massive, as you can see, probably, on the side. What could it be improved? I think because you can see here, obviously, 17-inch laptop, what happened? Oh, yes, this is effectively the P15 motherboard. So you have this much extra space. So from Lenovo's perspective, by using the same motherboard, they can achieve, I think, better costs. But that also means for a 17-inch workstation, you don't necessarily have something that's truly unique to your system, other than the beefy cooling. I mean, don't get me wrong, the beefy cooling is great, we'll take it. It's just, I think, when you have a 17-inch system and only have two M2, that's a little bit conspicuous. So more or less, the spec is limited to the P15 level. So this is like a super-sized P15 with better cooling, which I think in some ways suits what people want. But I mean, the desire is always for a more bespoke solution when it comes to the 17. If you pay this much, you would assume that you get something extra in addition to the extra cooling, which is useful. But yeah, so that's on the inside. I quite like it. It's if we just put it back. Don't watch how we put it back. Go and read the new hardware service menu and do this with care. Must not do a verge. Must not do a verge. Okay, one last thing is this is not the 4G model, so you can see the Sims here. It's yeah, on the inside you can see it's literally sealed. So it's, don't know if you have to drill through that. And so as you can see, it runs into here, but on there it doesn't have that extra connector. So you need to configure the 4G or be prepared to use an external Sims adapter. But yeah, it's from my perspective, it's from upgradability and repairability perspective, I think this system is really exciting. I don't know in the future if you can get cards to upgrade to aftermarket, but I mean that has warranty implications, but I mean that's exciting. And I think from just day-to-day average person maintenance perspective, it's just so good to have everything where remove the cover and you can see it. I think I was really scared to open this cover because of the cost of this machine. If I can be honest, I didn't want to open it. But having pried it open gently, it's a lot simpler than you might think. Obviously, disassemble at your own risk. So we're just tightening all the screws on the base cover after the removal of the cover. What we'll do is we'll take a look at under the keyboard. Usually to disassemble, you would just kind of undo this, take it off. 2 screws to access the keyboard. Again, obviously check the hardware service menu. Don't look at it off of YouTube. I think it's just a matter of sliding the keyboard. So what you do is slide the keyboard this way and take it up, move it gently. Take a look at aware of the ribbon underneath. So what we'll do is we'll just quickly, gently. Okay, so you'll see that these 2 connectors can be released to undo the keyboard. So this is a backlight for the keyboard, and that's the keys. So to access a RAM, we would need to remove this. So in theory, you need to disconnect those 2 so the keyboard is safely there. It's quite a satisfying slide. So as you can see, additional RAM. What we have here is where the 4G card would be, but as you can see, there is no antenna cable on this particular model, which is a shame. That's the Wi-Fi card, as you can see. It's quite a compact size. Really grateful at least that it's not a part of the motherboard, as you can see on some of the more modern ThinkPad. Anyway, well, just start to put it back. So we're just in the Blender doing the BMW. So if we take a look, so this has been running for a few minutes. The average CPU load, it's about 3.4 gigahertz. The CPU power, it can go up to about 100 at the maximum so far, but this is a GPU render, so I don't expect it to be CPU focused. But on the other hand, it's actually quite encouraging that the GPU, it can draw up to 93 watts. I think that's potentially the burst performance. But I think on average we're getting 86 watts power draw by the RTX 4000. This is good to see because I think on some of the previous version of this machine you were capped at a lower TDP. And I think in contrast to the gaming laptops, for instance, in the latest 30 series RTX gaming cards, you have the option between the 80 and 125 watts TDP for the graphic side. So, this is still quite on the safe side in terms of the graphics. So basically, when we look at the single run of the Cinebench, it's effectively about 10K score. So the average CPU is between 3.3 to 3.8 gigahertz. Yeah, as you can see, there are some bursts where AI used quite a lot of power, but on average it was about 80 watts. That's just under the PL1. So 30 minutes in, it's, as you can see, average temperature is quite high. I think the CPU is mostly 3.6 to 3.7 gigahertz, which is actually quite impressive during the run. So that's the score. It's about 10% lower than if we just ran it once. So it's still, because considering it's 8 cores. Let's take a look at the power usage and TDP of this laptop. So at the moment we've got Furmark running in the background. So this is GPU stress only at the moment. So as you can see, we've been running for about 15 minutes here. So the system is using just under 200 watts. Keep in mind the charger itself is 230. So it's running GPU only. It's getting quite close to the upper limits of what you can draw in terms of power, which is quite interesting. And the CPU power is, as you can see, it's 70 at the moment. So I wouldn't say it's without CPU load. But it's just not CPU heavy. What I wanted to show here, especially, is that the GPU power is 110 watts. So GPU power draw at the moment. This is on the higher side of what you can have on laptops. On some of the 30 series gaming laptop, you can go up to 125. So this is very decent for a laptop. I think in comparison to the P73, the generation before this, what you can see here on the Xeon model at least is PL1 is 90, PL2 is 135. So it can do very, very short bursts of 130, 135. We've not really seen it going that far. We've seen it going up to 127. You can probably stress it more. But when we do sustained CPU workload, it converges back down to about 86, something similar. So it's just under the PL1 limit when you're not doing the GPU stress. What that means is, in theory, if you max out the GPU at 110 watts and add in the 135 PL2, it actually exceeds the rating of the charger. So that's why I think it potentially might be useful in the future for Lenovo to get a bigger charger. For instance, Dell has 330 watts. It would certainly be interesting to see if Lenovo can produce a 280, 300 watts charger. That'd be nice, but those are quite heavy. And throughout this, you can see the CPU clock, because we're not doing much CPU workload, it's hovering at about 4.4. When you do CPU stuff, it would probably reduce quite quickly back down, as you can see. Yeah, so 3.4 already. So it will go. Let's take a look at what happens when we stress both the CPU and GPU. So the total system power, as you can see, at some point it went over the 230 charger rating, but it's normally kept at 230, so that's quite expected. Right, so the GPU power, it's stable at 110 watts. So what that means is there is some 120 watts left for the rest of the system effectively. And since we can see the CPU is here, I think the CPU is one that's being a little bit more elastic here in terms of the power that's is allocated. So as you can see, it's PL1, PL2 still there. We're only running 8 thread at the moment. I think it's just, otherwise it might cause our capturing software some instability. Right. Okay, well, it's quite good. It's CPU quite hot, GPU as well. As you can see, the temperature, it's the CPU is definitely on the hotter side. It's the average even is approaching 100. So Intel these days is running their processor definitely quite hot. The GPU seems okay. I think this is partly because NVIDIA may detect that this is firmware, so maybe clocking down the cores, but I'm not sure on that. What I'll probably say is it's really good to have the PL1 and PL2 at 90 and 135. On its predecessor, the PL1 and PL2 was, I think, maybe 70 and 107. So it's certainly gone up quite a bit. So especially this PL1, so that's the one that's more relevant. So that's the sustained workload. So you've gone up from 70 to 90 watts. So about 20 extra watts of headroom if you're just running the CPU stuff. I think that's really quite helpful for some workload potentially. But it's if you do both CPU and GPU, the difference will be a lot more nuanced. I think having a more beefy system in terms of cooling is just really welcomed. Let's take a look at the online config and the pricing. So if we click through, it seems it's a ready to ship model and you can build your own. The main difference is that if you want to customize, it takes a little extra until you get it. Ready to build systems, they're the popular specs, and some people prefer those because they're likely to get to you more quickly. What you also notice the starting price here versus a nearly loaded up unit. So it's really stark contrast because it's more than twice the cost. So what does it get you? So i9 versus i7, Pro versus Home, great screen versus good screen, more RAM, more storage, and warranty side, and looking all the way down, same battery, same webcam, etc. On the config page, there'll be some parts that are customer serviceable, and there's some parts that only Lenovo can change. So processor is something that only Lenovo really supplies. So I think going from 6 cores, I think to 8, I think that's a modest upgrade. And of course, you can see the i9 and the Xeon pricing are actually the same. So Xeon, if you spend that much already, it gives you the ECC memory support. So that's something that might be really useful. And as you can see, on some of the processor models, you don't have the vPro option. So for instance here, so you have the vPro on that. The next one up will be the i9, etc. So that's if you want certain management options, for instance, if you're deploying this. So RAM, so you have the option for 8 gig all the way up to 128. So this is considered user serviceable, so something that you as an end user can upgrade if needed without affecting the warranty. So 800 for the 128, first impression is actually it was pretty decent, I think. So if we take a look on Amazon at what's available, so 2 times 32 is 260 quid. If we get 2 of this, that's 520 pounds in the UK. So 520 versus 800, you would save about 280 pounds if you do it yourself. But if you only buy 2 of it, that's 260 pounds versus 260 versus 370. So yeah, there's definitely some saving potentially if you are looking at the really high-end RAM options. Okay, hard drive, same story. It's 2 drives to fill. So you can have the option to customize them both. I think the 512, this is actually quite similar to the price you pay for 500 gig standalone. So it's not bad, except you don't get the 256, I guess. As for the SSD pricing, as you can see, it's we have the 256 option. Obviously, it's going to be a little bit more price affordable if you do it yourself. But it's the price difference is more stark the higher the spec you go, it seems. So 500, so that's quite similar to that. So 50 pounds, you can basically buy it yourself if you go with the base and fit it yourself. Just to say, if you buy a drive yourself, whatever warranty you have is between you and the vendor of that. Whereas if you buy it from Lenovo, then that part will be covered under warranty for whatever warranty duration you have. So I think that's the attractive thing with buying it from the manufacturer. Just in case anything goes wrong, they'll help you there. Looking at the spec, we have the 4K upgrade. And as you can see, it's definitely a noticeable amount here in the UK. So we'll leave that for now. And I think looking at the pricing for the graphics, I think the RTX 3000 is actually quite advantageous in terms of the pricing versus the next few up. And I think the gap between RTX 4000 and 5000, I think, is really a big gap. I think whether the RTX 4000 may be actually quite a sensible choice. I think that's a decision for you, really. As for the 4G, as you can see, it's a £170 option, and they'll include the card for you. If we just leave that for now, and as we can see, we've currently selected standard graphics. If we upgrade to the RTX, then it would automatically change to a 230 watts charger. Just to say, even the base model, it's okay for SolidWorks 2011, and if you do go for something more powerful, it's usually if you have more complex assembly file in your CAD applications. So I think it's if you do want something powerful, then RTX 3000 Plus, I think that's the sensible choice. For the people who use CAD apps more lightly, then the T1000 and 2000 option will be quite competent. So I think the upgrades we've done is just get it to RTX 3000. When you check out, you can select what warranty level you want. It's a depot. I think it's okay. I think quite interestingly, we don't seem to have any on-site option. It's just Lenovo Depot or Premier, which is interesting. This probably varies depending on when or how you're looking at the website and in what country. So I think Year 4 is actually quite affordable, and I think personally, if I buy a laptop at this level, I would definitely want a longer warranty, because I mean, that's quite a sensible price. As you can see, going from Year 4 to Year 5, the price actually increases. It may reflect, it's having more servicing built in towards the end of the life cycle of a product. On the other hand, looking at the white glove option, it's Premier. It's quite a substantial cost. So in theory, with the depot, you still have the same parts, labor, warranty. It's just you have to send it to the repair center. The Premier one, it carries quite a big cost, but it's for the people who really needs that level of support. Accidental damage support, I think that's option some people go for. Not everybody necessarily needs it, and it's only for 3 years on this specific option. And of course, because the battery is built in, it may actually be quite sensible to opt for the sealed battery replacement warranty, because just in case your battery stops charging, let's say 1.5 years into it, you'll probably find that the cost to replace battery will be likely to be much higher. And just in case at some point your SSD fails, then if you select the keep your drive option, it's quite reassuring in that they would let you keep the drive and issue a replacement under warranty. The workstation docking is an interesting one, because effectively, if you get any RTX model, it would have the 230 charger, whereas the dock typically only supplies about 170 into the laptop. So you could actually get into a place where you're leaking power. So I think that's something hopefully we can see a bigger charger in the future. A lot more upsell options, but if we just leave those for now. I think overall it's quite an easy to understand laptop. It's the pricing, it's quite simple to understand. If you want better spec, you pay more price, and of course the Quadro, higher end Quadro is where the premium seems to be at. What we've seen is that the customer upgradable parts, if you do it yourself, you can definitely save some money, provided you're happy with the level of warranty that comes with them. So just a quick walkthrough of the Lenovo Vantage, which comes with the Lenovo laptops. So firstly, it lets you update the software on your laptop, so BIOS update, other stuff. I think personally this one is a little bit better than the HP and Dell. It's a little bit more extensive. Your mileage obviously may vary. You can check the warranty entitlement, extend or upgrade if you want it. So hardware scan, so that's the hardware diagnostics. So this is in addition to the boot level diagnostics. So you may want to run this occasionally. So that's the one I frequently see. Okay, what else is useful? So that shows you the system info, the power settings. What I really like about the Lenovo power management is that these days it's integrated into the Windows toggle.
So it's depending on which option you toggle. So basically high best performance. This one, it's just gives you all the performance, a little bit more noise. So this one might be the one you use every day. You can set the charge threshold preference. This is more a personal decision if you want to frequently leave the laptop on your desk. The airplane mode, I think usually disable this so the computer doesn't run slowly. Okay, so let's go to the audio screen. So on this laptop you have Dolby Atmos speaker system. So this is effectively an equalizer app. I personally always switch it off, but you can change to different mode, and you can set the specific equalizer for that mode. Personally, more of an audio purist, so I just switch it off. It does change the speaker quality a little bit. iCare, so this is Windows setting. Now, next we've got the window camera privacy mode. So this is a software setting that cuts off the video feed, which may be quite useful because physically switching it off, it's not the easiest slider. It's I can see the appeal of the software stuff. You can manually adjust the settings on webcam, contrast, and even disable the auto exposure. Oh, that's really dark. Let's just reset it back to normal. Okay, so that's quite fun. In the input tab, you have more settings. This is more the keyboard stuff. So you have more advanced Windows setup. You can do the function lock effectively and change the backlit setting. But I mean, obviously you can just press Ctrl and spacebar. More settings. I think this is one people probably mostly want. So function and control key swap, so it's not in the wrong order. I mean, personally, I just do this in BIOS, so it's easier. I prefer not to do that in the software. I think that's pretty much all there is. So as you can see, it's a 230 watts. Because Lenovo is one of the largest shipper of PCs and laptops, they very much have a vested interest in making sure this app is as efficient and easy to use as possible. That way their tech support people have to spend less time doing it, if that makes sense. So yeah, by and large, very easy to use. So if you do clean and install, I think this is an absolute must-get app. So you can just get it directly through the Windows App Store, or you can also get it online through Google Chrome. So it's quite easy to use. Would definitely recommend this if you have a Lenovo laptop. Okay, just quickly having chat about the warranty. So this unit has some warranty left. So to summarize, there's basically 3 tiers of warranty for the ThinkPad laptops in most countries. So you get depot, that's where you send it to a repair center. They get it back to you in 7 to 10 days. The time varies and depending on parts availability. The on-site option is quite a popular one, I think, in Europe at least. It's at the moment, due to COVID, it may be it's not quite on-site if it's residential address. For instance, they may pick up the laptop from you and give it back to you at the end of the day. But, you know, it's still faster than depot. And the premier support is their white glove, effectively, experience in terms of support. You get parts prioritization. Effectively, it's open that weekend, I think. Obviously, this depends on the country and some software support, but it's just that account manager relationship. So you can get issues, tickets logged more easily and more promptly. So less things to be concerned about. So it's a more simple way to get tickets logged. So some people really like this. It's usually for the larger companies and for the people whose laptop really needs to be working. It's where the functionality is really of the essence. So it's not always next day. It says next business day on-site labor. It's not always next day. What we mean by this is that not guaranteed in all countries, and sometimes the parts that you need to repair the laptop may be out of stock. So in those scenarios, although you probably get prioritization on those parts, it's not always next day service. With the P series, I think in most European regions, you probably get 3 years standard on site. So that's a good starting point. Some people makes it 5. That has a cost component, obviously. So it's do what's appropriate for you and whether you intend to keep it for that long. It could be that 2.5 years into it, you want to upgrade. Then at that point, if you pay more to upgrade the warranty, maybe it has some
implications on the resale value. Maybe you can get more for it, but if you spend a little bit less upfront, then obviously build that into your pricing and considerations. But yeah, I think having used all of these options, sometimes for the more complex tickets where, for instance, you're not quite sure what the precise issue is, even if you have on-site or Premier support level on that machine, they may still ask for you to send it to the depot so they can more holistically look at the system, because realistically, a technician on-site, they're not going to have more than a few parts to do the repair. So that's why sometimes they'll still ask you to get it in for depot servicing. Most of the time, it's hopefully this is not something that you actually need. It's only for when things need attention. It's really good to know that Lenovo has the infrastructure to stand behind their equipment. I think when you spend this much on a workstation, buying a laptop from Lenovo, Dell, HP is probably expected, because the hidden side of a laptop is that the servicing has to be just right, and when you spend this much, you really expect the premium support. If you buy let's say a Clevo laptop, or one of those unbranded laptop, even perhaps one of those new workstation from, let's say, MSI, something similar, they just wouldn't necessarily in all the countries have as much support infrastructure to be able to match what Lenovo, HP, Dell might have. It's just one of those scale thing. It's if you have enough systems to support, and if you ship so many systems, it makes sense to build those infrastructures. So just to continue on the Dell, you're going to have more M2 slots. I think up to 4 on the latest 17-inch precision model, the fully fledged one. So I think that's one of the advantages of the Dell option. But I think if you want the raw performance, then it's harder to beat the Lenovo with its 110 watts that I can allocate to the graphics. I think Lenovo is quite an interesting one, because if we look at the P73, I think they changed the performance profile of the laptop using BIOS update. So I think that one definitely got better later on. So I think Lenovo is one of those manufacturers where they can improve the performance level for the better. So I think we've seen that. On the P17 versus P53, I think in the real term, the performance uplift is actually not going to be massive. I think hopefully at some point the notebook check review will be out. But what is really obvious on paper is that for Xeon processor, at least the PL1 performance is up from about 70 watts to about 90 watts, and PL2 has been increased from just over 100 to 135. So in theory, its CPU can be given more power to run the sustained workload. So I think that's what matters. In this testing, I think we've quite easily seen for a few times where we were literally draining the 230 watts charger allowance. By contrast, Dell has a 240 watts charger, and you can also get to 330 watts on some of the models, I think. So it's definitely probably something for Lenovo to have a think about, maybe including a bigger charger for the really high-end models, just so they can run as intended. I think it might be that in the future, if Intel becomes more power efficient, we wouldn't be having this chat. But it's when you have a processor as powerful as this, we've really rarely seen it going above 5 gigahertz. It's promised 5.3, but this is quite nitpicky. Anyway, we hope this has helped. Overall, really good laptop. It's slightly let down by the keyboard. Very similar otherwise to the P73, but thankfully has improved cooling. So I think that's all I can say. The only hope in the next generation is that it has more M2 slots, and that probably we can get a bigger charger, hopefully. Please. Anyway, thank you for watching. Any other comment, just drop it in the comment section.